We talked recently about the award season coming up, and one performance that's getting a lot of attention is Ethan Hawke in First Reformed. So today we're going to talk about Ethan Hawke in First Reformed. I last saw First Reformed at the Loft several months ago, so real quick, I'm going to go ahead and watch it again on Amazon Prime to see if my thoughts from back then still hold up. Yep, still fucking hate it.
I don't know what to say.
So First Reformed is a movie by Paul Schrader, who famously did Taxi Driver. He wrote and directed First Reformed. Stars Ethan Hawke, Amanda Seyfried, Cedric the Entertainer. Paul Schrader, as we all know, is neither Dutch nor Danish, so I'm not going to be getting any hate mail for this review. Are you still laughing over there?
Yeah, I really enjoyed that.
He enjoys the Dutch and the Danish. Ethan Hawke plays a priest at the First Reformed Church. He goes to visit Amanda Seyfried's husband, their parishioners, or at least Amanda Seyfried is. And he begins to talk with this man about why he's so discontent and why he's so stressed out. Amanda Seyfried is pregnant with a child, and the man basically says that he doesn't think it's right to bring a child into this earth. And Ethan Hawke is sent there to kind of counsel and provide guidance. It's quickly apparent that the husband is the member of this radical kind of environmental movement. I don't want to say like a terrorist group, because I think that's loading it a little bit too much, but they're a group that goes around and they petition, they protest for environmental causes all around the world. He's talking about people who are members of the cause who have been killed and slaughtered, and he's clearly a big proponent of environmental reform to protect the Earth, as it seems as if we're reaching a tipping point for global warming and environmental disaster. The reason why, for me, the term terrorism becomes very important is because shortly after the counseling session, Ethan Hawke is called to the scene where he's supposed to meet the husband for a second time, finds him dead, and he's killed himself, and Amanda Seyfried brings him to their house where she has found a suicide vest. This is all in the first act or so I don't think that that's really any kind of a spoiler. Really what the rest of the film deals with is Ethan Hawke in possession of this suicide vest as he learns more about the environmental cause and as he kind of questions life, questions whether he has hope in the world, and questions whether or not he still believes. And in sort of a Paul Schrader tradition, throughout the film, the character's ideals progress, his concepts of the world around him progress, and his perspective progresses, leading to a very tension-filled third act. Obviously, we try not to spoil the movie on this show, so I'm going to pull back a little bit and just talk more about what makes the film work and why I really didn't like it. First and foremost, I will say this. Ethan Hawke is fantastic in this movie. It's one of his best roles, and I can see why there's so much buzz around him and the performance. The Paul Schrader script is very similar to what you're used to. It's a very high-level script that has a lot of interesting ideas and philosophies. But the biggest thing at the core of this film is the idea of hope versus despair. And it's something that is filling the character that kills himself, obviously, and it's something that really is at the core of Ethan Hawke's character. The issue with Ethan Hawke's character is that you're watching him progress throughout the 2-hour runtime and figuring out what he believes in the world, what he believes about the religion and theology, and where he fits in. But there are some problems. What you find out pretty early on, so again, doesn't feel like a spoiler, is that he is incredibly sick. One of the first scenes that you see of Ethan Hawke by himself, he's literally pissing blood. And he's a character who really seems to be a lost soul. Part of that goes into some personal tragedy, which I won't get into, but at the end of the day, it's a very sick character physically who's really trying to wrap his mind around what utility there is in the world and what his role in the world is. And while that's very effective and interesting from a character perspective, you've kind of got all these different characteristics that make for a really interesting setup to a film. All the different philosophies, all of the different items like the explosive vest, all of the characteristics like how sick that character is. But the character kind of begins the film kind of doomed. So by the time that you get to the end of it, where you're supposed to find some resonance and meaning in the development of the character, you kind of wonder if there really is any point in that character developing, since he already kind of has his fate sealed. I think part of the problem for this film, at least for me, is there are so many elements of it that are very loaded. They chose a very interesting dynamic and issue to approach from the environmental side of things. It's something that necessarily isn't talked about a lot, and it's something that, for the audience, you can easily side with the characters who think that it's something worth fighting or even dying for. And you really can't help but wonder how the film would come off, or look, or feel if they'd made some different choices. For instance, if it wasn't about environmental terrorism, but it was about anti-war, or if it was more of a political movement. For instance, if it had been, instead of a church and a priest, if it had been a mosque and an imam. how would that have changed the tonality of the film? Would it be asking different questions, or would the audience be projecting more onto that film, or would the writer be including a lot more subliminally? So by going with a church and a priest, it almost feels like they're taking kind of an easy way out and backing away from discussion. And that's not to say that one is better than the other, but the film obviously thinks a lot about the types of characters that it chooses, the types of visuals they use, and the type of messages behind the narrative. And as you're sitting there watching the movie, there are often moments of silence where you're sitting there and your mind is able to wander. And for me, it kept coming back to, could this film have said more interesting things with different characters in a different environment, in a different context? And part of me almost felt like even the opportunity to explore theology and Christian dynamics in relation to environmentalism weren't really explored as they could have been. And when a film is so deliberate, it forces you to ask questions about purpose and why and substance and meaning. And I think in the end, that was the biggest failure for me, because I'll be the first to say, the first 2/3 of the movie, I was riveted, I was really engaged in it. It's shot beautifully. Schrader decides to use almost like a 4:3 aspect ratio on it, so it's shot kind of boxy, like what you'd see from like a TV. And part of the reason for that is it forces you to focus on the characters and the actions and what's in the frame. And I think that's really where my complaint is. What's in the frame, what's in the story, and what's left out. And it feels like sometimes what's left out, or alternative decisions or storytelling mechanics, almost would have been more substantive and meaningful to develop the questions the film is trying to ask. Because I think at the end of the film, walking out of it, the people that I saw the film with shared my perspective, where when you reached the ending, you weren't really sure on what the film was trying to convey. Performances are great, the cinematography is great, the pacing, I mean, everything is just done really well. It leaves you feeling like you're missing something, like you're missing either the point to it or the fulfillment and gratification at the end of it. There's also a lot of imagery and I believe symbolism at the end of the film that to me just kind of came off as hackish. And to clarify, when I say hacky, I mean it in the sense that there's a specific moment in the ending that utilizes certain imagery that just feels forced. It almost feels melodramatic in a sense. And while that can work if the film has built to it or it feels like it's a payoff, in this sense, it's really part of a conclusion that you don't quite reach. And so it feels as if it's just for the spectacle of the whole thing. Who should see it? Well, the acting is really, really good. The caveat there is, while Ethan Hawke is great, you really need to find a way to empathize with the character, and he might be a bit distant for some viewers. And sort of going back to what I said about Tyrell, it can be difficult to empathize with a character who has so many deficiencies in themselves. And yes, it is supremely meaningful and can be used very effectively that the character is sick, or in Ethan Hawke's case, that the character is constantly drinking and that he has so many inner demons. But at a certain point in the film, you just feel like you're watching somebody who's self-destructive, who never self-destructs. And that can feel very empty and shallow and meaningless. For Amanda Seyfried, she's fantastic, but I don't really think her character has a lot to work with. Cedric the Entertainer is really good at what he does. He entertained me. Is it Schrader's best work? No. Did I expect it to be better than everything he's done before? Not really. But I would have been able to enjoy it had it just been good in its own right. Who shouldn't see it? You know, if you're really not into kind of films that are half cinema and half political or philosophical discussion, it may be a bit too introspective in that sense. It really is asking more questions than it's answering. And that can be good. We've discussed that before, but in this film, it wasn't its strongest feature. And if you're not into that to begin with, don't even bother. It's very slow paced and it's very acting driven without a lot of things happening. So if you're not into those kinds of films, if you like to have kind of the film come to you as opposed to the film asking you to come to it, it's probably not going to be very enjoyable. And at the end of the day, if you're going into it expecting some sort of transformation or meaningful development that leaves you feeling as if you've really followed a character through a progression and a development and an evolution, I just don't think it's there. And I struggle because I never want to come on and say, like, this is a bad movie. But I guarantee you, I would never watch this again. And perhaps it could have been better, and I say this sometimes, if it were a short film. I mean, if it was something that was compact in 30 minutes and you kind of got into the character, you had your development and you got out, maybe it would have been stronger. But for all of the interesting set pieces, all of the interesting developments and items and all of the pieces that are there, the puzzle just never comes together and it just really leaves you unsatisfied. A couple things on a final note, I'm not trying to make any enemies here, but Paul Schrader has come out and had a few comments since this movie was released. One was that audiences these days are sort of, and I'm paraphrasing, like too lazy to really appreciate cinema. And I get that. I think there are a lot of people who aren't willing to sit through something that is slower, deliberately paced, something that asks a lot of questions. The idea that audiences are only willing to sit through an Avengers film. I understand that. I understand that frustration, but for me, I was sold on this film going into it. I appreciated its pacing. It doesn't change the fact that there wasn't much of a reward to be had at the end of it. And I think that can be a bigger issue. Whether somebody can appreciate the pacing or not is a little independent of if they found meaning in the film. Somebody might just say it was slow and boring, but that at least it had. And for this film, it's the performances. And that's great. I sometimes would go to see a play or a movie just because of the performances, but I would still critique the film for lacking in other substance. The other thing that he said was, he was talking about celebrities and people being kind of blackballed from Hollywood, and he brought up Kevin Spacey, and he got into this whole diatribe where he said people suffering for their art. I don't want to get into that, but I will say this. I suffered for First Reformed, and I do not appreciate that experience.
You are gonna burn in hell.